So Trump has spent months calling Canada an American charity case and saying that we take advantage of the US. Well, guess what, Donald? Canada just posted its biggest goods trade surplus in over a year, $2.7 billion. Exports hit a record, $75 billion in a single month. And the surplus with the United States, that widened to $9.5 billion.
Yeah, let that land for a second. Canada basically walked into April and posted numbers that make every one of those claims look ridiculous. $75 billion in exports. Not just oil either. That's cars, trucks, grain, machinery, aircraft parts, chemicals, plastics. It's a broad industrial strength across the board.
And here's the part that actually is dangerous for America. The surplus with the U.S. specifically, it widened to $9.5 billion. And that is the highest it's been since before Trump's first round of tariffs. He imposed them, he threatened more, and the cat got bigger.
So, the economic war he launched, the one he said would bring Canada to its knees, well, it didn't. It did the opposite. And we're going to walk through exactly how that happened, what it says about who actually needs who in this relationship, and why Washington right now is scrambling for an answer that they don't have.
Okay, let's break this down because the numbers themselves, they really tell the story before we even get into the politics of it all.
You said it. So, merchandise trade, that's physical goods, not services. Canada posted a $2.7 billion surplus in April, and that's the biggest since early 2025. And exports? $75 billion, Dave. That's not a typo. It's a record high, the most ever.
Now, you hear that and you think, oh, oil prices went up, right? And yep, true. Crude was part of that. Energy exports rose. But here's what gets missed. You know what also rose? All that other stuff like machinery and equipment, vehicles, grain, aircraft and transportation parts rose. Chemicals, plastics, rubber products, all of those rose. This wasn't just one commodity carrying the month. This was a really broad selection.
And this is important because if it was just oil, Trump would say, see, they're just lucky on crude prices. He can't say that when it's 7 or 8 different sectors all climbing at once.
And then you flip the lens to the U.S. specifically, and the surplus with the U.S. widened to that $9.5 billion in April. That is the highest since before the first Trump tariffs.
So let's think about the timeline here. Trump imposed tariffs in his first term. He threatened way more in his second, and he called Canada a national security threat. He talked about the 51st state. He sent his trade guide to demand concessions, and after all of that, the trade gap got bigger with Canada, not smaller.
Just more evidence that his tantrum-based trade policy is a complete failure.
Just like all his businesses. So why is this happening? And why can't the U.S. just, turn off the Canada tap, for example? Well, the answer is they physically can't. And that's the part Trump's whole economic argument collapses on.
Yeah, the U.S. depends on Canada for energy, Canadian oil, natural gas, electricity. It all flows south every single day. American refineries are configured for Canadian crude. You can't just swap it out overnight.
Right. And that it's not just energy. Canadian auto parts cross the border 6-7 times before a finished vehicle rolls off the line. That's engines, transmissions, electronics. The entire supply chain doesn't recognize a border.
Canadian lumber is another great example. It builds American houses. Canadian potash fertilizes American farms. Canadian aluminum goes into American planes and trucks. The idea that the U.S. can just tariff its way out of needing these things, it's not a real idea. It's a complete fantasy.
And here's the number that makes the whole tariff strategy look genuinely unhinged. Are you ready, Dave? 38 million Canadians. That's our entire population. We buy more American exports than 1.4 billion people in China.
So you got a country that depends on you for energy, for auto parts, for lumber, for food, and they're also the number one buyer of everything that you sell, that's not dependency. That's a two-way relationship.
Bingo. And Trump's approach to that relationship is what? Threats, tariffs, 51st state. He's treating the country his own economy relies on most like a problem to be solved, not a partner worth keeping. It's the kind of move that only makes sense if you've never actually looked at the data or taken a business course, which is true for Trump.
Yeah. Or if you have actually looked at the numbers, you just don't care. Because the point with his tariffs was never economics. It was all theater.
So let's talk about tariffs directly because this surplus proves something about how they actually work. Trump's whole trade philosophy, if you can call it a philosophy at all, is that tariffs punish the other country and fix trade deficits.
And the U.S. trade deficit in April, $55.9 billion. So after all the tariffs, all the threats, all that tough guy talk, still a massive deficit. And why? Because tariffs are a blunt instrument. They raise costs for American companies and American consumers. They distort supply chains and they invite retaliation. But they do not fix the underlying reason a trade deficit exists.
The U.S. runs a deficit because Americans consume more than they produce, and the dollar is the world's reserve currency. That's not Canada's fault. That's not something a tariff on lumber can fix.
And when you layer on political uncertainty, those constant tariff threats, sudden reversals, and midnight truth social rants, everyone in the business world starts to question stability. They freeze hiring, they delay expansion, because who wants to build a factory when the rules might change on Tuesday?
And here's the wild part. Canada still posted a surplus. Despite all of that, despite the hostile trade environment, the uncertainty, the threats, Canada's economy absorbed the chaos and still came out ahead. And I am sure the Conservatives will weigh in here and say, well, it's just luck. But it's not. It's an economy that's more resilient than Washington wants to admit.
So where does this leave us? Because the surplus is great, but this isn't just a victory lap, because Canada's dependence on the U.S. market is both a strength and a vulnerability. When your biggest customer is also unpredictable, then you need a backup plan.
And that's what Mark Carney has been signaling for 18 months. Diversification, not as a threat and not as some dramatic break with the U.S., but as a practical reality. Trade with the U.S. because it makes sense, but when it stops making sense,
well, you need other options. The EU trade deal, deeper ties with Japan and ASEAN, east-west infrastructure, so we're not just shipping everything south.
Canada has a lot of cards to play. The whole deck, actually. We have energy, food, critical minerals, fresh water, technology, and an educated workforce. The most highly educated in the world, I might add.
Yep.
And we have ports on 3 oceans. We're not a charity case that Trump keeps claiming, waiting for American permission.
Look, the surplus proves that the U.S. needs Canada. It proves tariffs didn't work. It proves that threatening your best customer is a terrible strategy. But it also proves that Canada can weather the storm.
So the question isn't whether Canada survives Trump's trade war. We just proved we can. The question is whether we use this moment to build something more durable, an economy that isn't one election in Washington away from a crisis.
So here's where we're landing on all of this. Trump's economic war was supposed to make Canada beg. Well, instead, Canada posted a record export month and widened its surplus with the U.S. to $9.5 billion.
The tariffs didn't fix the U.S. trade deficit. It hit $55.9 billion in April alone. The threats didn't make Canada fold, and the 51st state garbage didn't intimidate anybody.
And basically, when you think about it, the dependency argument got flipped. The U.S. needs Canadian energy, Canadian auto parts, Canadian lumber, Canadian food, and Canadian minerals. The surplus proves they need us more than the tough talk ever admitted.
So Canada, we have leverage, we have options, and the smart play now is to use both.
So we want to hear from you on this. We've got two questions. First, does this surplus change your view of where Canada stands in this trade fight?
And second, does Trump double down on tariffs after these numbers, or does he quietly back off and say, he was my plan all along?
Let us know in the comments because we love hearing from you. We want to know where your head is at when it comes to this.
And if you found this useful, give it a like, drop a hype, and share it. It helps us more than you know.
And check out the pinned comment for all the good stuff. Thanks for watching, everybody, and we'll see you tomorrow.
Ciao for now.